Through the kindness of our donors, the National Catholic Broadcasting Council presents Let Us Reflect Together. The Promises of Advent. Second week of Advent, the promise is spoken. The prophet Isaiah, with Jesuit Father Michael Coutts. God will never forget you. A reading from the book of the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah foretells a new ruler from Jesse's line upon whom God's Spirit will rest. A shoot shall come out of the stump of Jesse, and the branch shall grow out of his roots. The Spirit of the Lord shall rest on him.
Some years ago, my uncle Joe Rivera died on Christmas Eve. He was a gentle soul, generous to a fault. That year, Christmas celebrations were subdued. We could sing Silent Night, but when it came to go tell it over the mountain, the words caught in our throats. There was pain, there was sorrow. Isaiah spoke to a people in pain, the people of Judah longing for deliverance. He told them that from the stump of Jesse a new shoot would grow. From what was dead, new life would spring. It was a vision of the Messiah's coming, a life that would begin in the quiet town of Bethlehem, heralded by angels, yet already overshadowed by the cross of Calvary. Our hymn for the second week of Advent is Lo, How a Rose Ere Blooming, which speaks of the tender fragrance filling the air, sweetness breaking into a world of darkness and gloom. Isaiah did not shy away from the truth. From the very first chapter, he condemns the sin of God's people. Israel was unfaithful, like a body wounded and battered, longing for healing. To that brokenness came further indignity. Foreigners devoured the land and desolation spread. Yet the promise remained. The Messiah would come. God would save his people, rescue them from distress, and carry them like a shepherd carries a lamb in his arms. Even when the people persisted in sin, God's voice did not falter. I will never forsake you. Can a nursing mother forget her child? Even if she should forget, I will never forget you. I have carved you into the palm of my hands. Advent is a time of hope and joy, but it is also honest. It remembers the reality of sin, of apathy towards the poor, the voiceless, and the marginalized. It calls us to prepare, not only with the lights and carols, but with hearts awake to the coming of the One who makes all things new.
Join us tomorrow for Our Hope Endures with Jesuit Father Michael Coutts.